The moment the palace doors didn't just close, but slammed something far more explosive than a family disagreement detonated behind those gilded walls. Because this wasn't about a missed invitation, it was about power, humiliation, and a king who finally decided he had been played for far too long. What really happened in those tents? Ticking hours before the deadline is where the story stops being polite and starts becoming dangerous. A royal invitation, carefully calculated, quietly extended, and loaded with meaning, was left hanging in silence. Not hours, not a day, an entire week. And that silence, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't confusion. It was strategy. Because while King Charles waited, balancing duty, illness, and what little remained of paternal hope, Prince Harry moved differently. Public appearances, strategic leaks, carefully worded statements that didn't just delay a response, they reshaped the narrative. And then came the pivot, the sudden yes after an initial no. But timing is everything in royal logistics, and this wasn't a casual dinner invite. This was Buckingham Palace, an operation of precision, security, and symbolism. You don't just change your mind at the last minute and expect the monarchy to rearrange itself. That's not how this machine works. And Harry knew that, which raises the question no one inside the palace is willing to say out loud: was the delay the point all along? Because the moment the palace declined the late acceptance, the narrative flipped instantly. Suddenly, it wasn't about missed deadlines, it was about rejection, coldness, a father denying his son. The optics were explosive, and yet behind closed doors, something else was happening. Something colder, more calculated, because reports didn't just land, they hit like a trigger. Leaks, media positioning, a carefully constructed storyline painting the king as desperate, emotional, willing to bend rules. That wasn't just storytelling, that was pressure. And that's where everything changed. Because King Charles didn't respond emotionally. He didn't issue a dramatic statement. He didn't engage. He executed. Swiftly, completely, irreversibly. The invitation wasn't just declined, it was erased. Every open door, shut. Every soft landing, withdrawn. Every lingering privilege, revoked. And the message, though never spoken directly, echoed louder than any press conference: the monarchy is not a stage, and it will not be used. But the real shock wasn't the rejection. It was what came next. Instead of reacting, the palace suffocated the situation. A wall of duty. A calendar so packed, so immovable, it became a weapon. Every hour accounted for. Every appearance locked. A schedule that didn't just signal busyness, it signaled exclusion. There was no room. Not physically, not symbolically, not emotionally. And suddenly, the narrative Harry's camp had been building began to collapse under the weight of something far more powerful than words: indifference. Because nothing is more devastating than being denied attention. And inside that silence, another layer started to emerge. Patterns, familiar ones. The same playbook, the same timing tactics, the same attempt to control perception before reality could catch up. But this time, the palace didn't play along. This time, the king aligned not as a father, but as a sovereign. And more importantly, he aligned with someone else who had seen this coming long before anyone wanted to admit it: Prince William. Because for years, William's stance had been dismissed as cold, unforgiving, too rigid. But now, it looked less like stubbornness and more like foresight. Because while Charles hesitated, William calculated. And now, for the first time, they were moving as one. No cracks, no emotional leverage, no divide to exploit. And that changes everything. Because the entire strategy, the entire narrative relied on that gap. The emotional father versus the institutional heir. The soft heart versus the hard line. But what happens when that gap disappears? What happens when the king stops being accessible and starts being absolute? That's the question no one in Montecito can comfortably answer right now. Because this wasn't just a rejected visit, it was a reset. A line drawn so clearly, so decisively, that crossing it again may no longer even be possible. And yet, something about the timing still doesn't sit right. The court case, the media buildup, the sudden urgency, it all feels connected, like pieces of a larger move that didn't quite land the way it was supposed to. What the world didn't immediately see, but what quietly detonated behind palace walls, was that this wasn't just a tactical rejection. It was the beginning of something far more ruthless, a complete system shutdown of access, influence, and relevance. Because once the invitation was revoked, the palace didn't pause, it accelerated. Fast, controlled, surgical, and suddenly, every move coming out of Buckingham Palace felt less like reaction and more like a pre-planned containment strategy. Because think about it, why publish such an aggressively packed royal schedule immediately after the fallout? Why flood the public domain with a calendar so suffocatingly dense it left zero room for interpretation. That wasn't coincidence. That was messaging. Not spoken, not emotional, not even defensive, but absolute. There is no time. There is no space. There is no meeting. And more importantly, there will not be one. And that kind of silence, it's louder than any denial. But beneath that silence, another uncomfortable truth began surfacing. This wasn't just about a failed visit or miscommunication. It was about control over narrative and, more dangerously, control over monetization. Because as whispers grew louder about filming plans, about leveraging proximity to royal spaces, about capturing moments that were never meant to be public, the stakes shifted. This wasn't family anymore. This was content. High-value, emotionally charged, globally marketable content. And the palace saw it coming just in time. Because imagine the optics. A private reunion, a grandfather meeting grandchildren, cameras somewhere nearby, even discreetly, even subtly. That footage alone, priceless, not emotionally, but commercially. And suddenly, the invitation starts to look different, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as an opportunity waiting to be packaged. And that's when the line stopped being blurred. Because once the palace realized that even private moments could be repurposed, edited, sold, and broadcast, the entire risk calculation changed overnight. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore, it was about containment, protecting not just the institution, but its most vulnerable human moments from becoming product. And the reaction? Immediate, total unforgiving. But here's where the story twists even deeper. Because while the palace was shutting doors, something else was quietly collapsing across the Atlantic. Financial pressure, mounting costs, contracts that suddenly didn't feel as secure as they once did. Because maintaining that level of global security, that lifestyle, that image, it doesn't sustain itself. And when the revenue streams begin to tighten, every opportunity becomes critical. Every appearance, every connection, every possible royal association becomes leverage. And suddenly that urgent need to reconnect starts to look less emotional and more strategic. Which raises an uncomfortable question no one wants to confront directly. Was this about family or survival? Because the timing doesn't just feel coincidental, it feels synchronized. Legal battles heating up, media narratives intensifying, public appearances carefully placed. And then, right at the center of it all, a royal invitation that could have reset everything if handled differently. But it wasn't. It became a trigger instead. And the fallout didn't stop at the palace gates. Because once the king made his decision, once he aligned fully with the hardline approach, something irreversible happened inside the royal structure itself. The last emotional opening closed. The final what if disappeared. And in its place, a unified front so solid, so coordinated, that it effectively erased any remaining ambiguity about where things stand. No mixed signals, no back channels, no soft entries. And that's devastating, not publicly, but strategically. Because for years, the possibility of return, of reconciliation, of partial reintegration, that possibility itself held value. It sustained relevance. It kept doors symbolically open. But now, that illusion has been stripped away completely. And without that connection, even just perceived, the entire positioning shifts from insider to outsider, from participant to observer, from relevance to distance. And that shift, it doesn't just change optics, it changes everything. But even now, something doesn't fully settle, because stories like this don't end cleanly. They evolve, they escalate, they circle back in ways no one predicts. And if this entire sequence, from delayed responses to revoked invitations to total shutdown, was part of a larger play that misfired, then the next move becomes even more unpredictable. Because when one strategy collapses, another always begins. And the question lingering in the background, the one no statement, no schedule, no silence has answered yet, is simple: what comes next when every door is already closed?